Hi, my name is Professor Jennifer Burns, and I'd like to welcome you to History 7B. These lectures were recorded in the spring of 2006 at the University of California, Berkeley. History 7B is an introductory level course designed to familiarize students with the broad sweep of United States history, from the Civil War to the present day. When these lectures were recorded, there were 450 students enrolled in the class. So you'll hear me reference assigned readings, exams, and papers, which luckily you podcasters don't have to complete. But if you'd like to see the syllabus, offer a comment, or learn more about my work, please visit my website at www.jenniferburns.org. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the lectures.
Hey, good morning. I think you should all get extra credit for being here. The EVO spring break. Thank you for showing up, a smaller audience than usual. I'm usually somewhat reluctant to take questions and things midstream because it's such a big audience, but maybe we can take advantage of the more intimate numbers here. If you have a question, something you want to talk about during this lecture, just raise your hand, or maybe we can talk about some of this stuff towards the end. What I'd like to do today is start to wrap up World War II. It's been going on for an entire week now, if you noticed. Sort of a record for this class. I guess the Depression lasted almost a week as well. But World War II is just so big and so complicated, I wanted to slow down and try to unpack the different pieces of it as much as I could in different lectures. So on Monday, I talked about how it transformed the U.S. economy and sort of dragged us out of the Great Depression, put an end to the economic crisis that had been managed to some degree with the New Deal, but not really ended with the New Deal. And then on Wednesday, I talked about the Pacific Front and the way once the United States started fighting Japan, the war quickly became racialized, conceived by many people as a race war, and had very serious consequences, as we saw, for Japanese Americans living in America, leading up to their internment. So what I want to talk about today is returning to the European front, describe some basic contours of what's going on there, a couple incidents where American forces made a huge difference in the course of the war. And this, I think, focusing on the European front will help us see one of the major outcomes of the war, which, as I mentioned this in Monday's lecture, the European standard of living, dropped by almost a third. They had very little basic supplies, basic necessities. As you're going to see, cities were bombed out, huge loss of life, whereas during the same period of time, the United States standard of living went up 15%. Looking at how these trends play out over the course of the war and then after, you see one of the biggest results of the war, which is the United States emerging as a global superpower. As some people say, the global superpower, not even a superpower, but the global superpower, with an economy that's incredibly strong, almost no competition from the rest of the industrialized Europe because they suffered such a heavy toll during the war. So that's one of the major sort of outcomes or significances of the war. The other two items I'm going to talk about today also tie into the aftermath of the war, two atrocities that really dwarf the imagination. On a scale it's almost impossible to conceive of. I'll do my best to sketch out what happened. I'm referring first to the Holocaust, the name we now use for the destruction of the European Jewry by the Nazi regime, and that having important consequences for the post-war world insofar as it provides a really strong impetus to the founding of the State of Israel, which will happen 3 years after the war, and is changing the face of the modern Middle East. And as we know, this is a set of geopolitical issues we still wrestle with today, a lot of these stemming right from what happened during the war. And then the dropping of the atomic bomb, the first deployment of nuclear technology used on two Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, again setting us up for the post-war world by ushering in the atomic age, ushering in nuclear arms race, making the whole world aware of this fearsome technology we had, setting out a whole new set of issues for nations. for nations to compete for rivalry, military strategy, and then, of course, leading into a nuclear arms race between the United States and the USSR. So all of these things I'm talking about, sort of the European front, the Holocaust, and the atomic bomb, really feed into what's going to be an emerging new world order after World War II, very different than before, and with legacies that we are still dealing with every day today. So let me start with the European front. Although, as I said, it was Pearl Harbor that really propelled the United States into war, pretty soon after that, the British Prime Minister Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt agreed on what was called a Germany First strategy, that on balance Germany posed a greater threat and they would put the bulk of their resources against Germany while sort of fighting a holding pattern in the Pacific War, wait until they had slowed or stopped the German advance, German military victories, and then turn to the Pacific Front. Now, the European front was so remote, Europe was so remote from Americans. Remember I talked about this isolationist urge. Very few Americans, except for the elite, traveled abroad. Very few Americans had any idea where any of this was happening. So Roosevelt would, when he did his weekly fireside chats, his radio address, would say to his audience, take out a map, lay out a map of Europe, follow me here, and he would sort of walk them through where the conflict was happening, describing the different countries, describing why they were important. So he still retained his role as an educator and trying to explain to the American people what we were doing over there and why it was important, and having to really get down to the specifics of geography, which was for many Americans just Europe was sort of an unknown wash. So in 1942, which is really when the U.S. comes into the war, it's a pretty bad situation in Europe. Germany has expanded. So the yellow here is the Axis powers. You've got Germany and Italy in yellow. The peach color is the area under Axis control. So as you can see, I described this on Monday. Germany swallowed Poland. It got half of Poland through the Munich Agreement and then took the rest on its own. Then it went out to scoop up these other countries. It also pushed towards the east, took over almost all of France, and was bombarding London very heavily during 1941. Also, you'll note that it's pushed into northern Africa and pretty much has taken control of all this area. So if you look at this map of Europe, you can see that in a very short amount of time, the German war machine has just expanded over an immense amount of territory. So this is what the Allies are looking at when the United States joins. You have the Soviet Union here. Germany, after signing the Nazi-Soviet pact, a year later, turned around and attacked Russia. So an initial period of friendship gave way to a full-on attack. So throughout 41, 42, 43, Germany is just pounding on the Russian lines and making a lot of incursions. These red arrows indicate how far the German army got in. A few neutral nations here, Spain, Turkey, Egypt, managed to somewhat stay out. And then you have poor Great Britain, the only green nation here besides the Soviet Union, but really on its own, facing this huge Nazi onslaught. So there's the territorial acquisitions. There's also the German U-boats, which you remember from World War I, have gotten even more advanced, more powerful, and are essentially controlling the seas. In the first half of 42, they sink 400 American ships in what are supposedly U.S.-controlled waters. So even though